So before I start this video, I would like to give you my disclaimer. A lot of people are going to be offended by this video, and I'm not going to apologize. If you're offended, I want you to tell me why in the comments section. And also share this video with all of your friends and tell them why you're offended. Because I'm serious. A lot of people are going to be offended. And not just Muslims, but Jews are going to be offended, Christians are going to be offended, Democrats are going to be offended, Republicans are going to be offended. Basically, everybody's going to be offended. And I know that, but despite the fact that they're all going to be mad at me, I'm going to say what needs to be said. And there you go, that's my disclaimer. Now I can start my video. So, today, I'm going to explain why you should not join ISIS, why that's a bad idea.
Oh, really? Are you going to read from the Quran and quote Muhammad?
Nah.
Why not?
Because that's not going to work.
Why not?
Well, because first of all, I'm not any kind of Islamic scholar. So if I tried to explain to you why you should not join ISIS from like a Muslim perspective, you probably wouldn't listen to me. But the guys from ISIS aren't any kind of Islamic scholars either, and you shouldn't listen to them either. Second of all, a lot of real Islamic scholars have made videos explaining from a Muslim perspective why you should not join ISIS. And while I'm not going to say that they haven't convinced anybody not to join ISIS, a lot of people are still joining ISIS. So as long as even one person is even still considering joining ISIS, somebody needs to try to convince you from another perspective. So I'm going to explain why you should not join ISIS from the perspective of history and current events. And if you're actually thinking about joining ISIS, you're probably of the opinion that almost all of the other Muslims are wrong, but you're right. So one of the people from that other group of Muslims that you think are wrong, trying to convince you from a Muslim perspective that they're right and you're wrong, probably isn't going to work on you. And the reason is it's because you've been brainwashed by ISIS's propaganda. So I'm not going to try to undo that brainwashing by saying anything to refute any of their propaganda. I'm just going to explain where their propaganda comes from. And it comes from a person's secret agenda, who's not a Muslim person, by the way, that you need to know about. So I'm going to explain why you should not join ISIS from a perspective of history and current events. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the mass murder of millions of Jews, which is now known as the Holocaust. Now I'm going to talk about why we probably shouldn't call it the Holocaust a little bit later, but right now, that is the official word for the mass murder of millions of Jews that occurred during World War II. So I'm going to call the Holocaust during this video, but later on, I'm going to explain why we probably shouldn't call it that. So what happened during World War II? Why did the Holocaust happen? To understand why the Holocaust happened, we have to understand the events that led up to the Holocaust. First, Zionism. Jewish people had been living all across Europe for a long time, and during their entire history of living in Europe, they'd been persecuted. Sometimes they'd been persecuted in a violent way. Sometimes they'd be murdered for being Jewish, for example. So, partly because of this long history of persecution, some of these Jews decided that they needed their own homeland. They decided that Jewish people couldn't ever really integrate to European society. They would always be separate. And rather than living in European society and trying to integrate when they really should be separate, they should just move back to their ancient homeland of Israel. Now, at the time when these guys started pushing Zionism, most of the other Jews were like, "You're crazy. You're coming at me and you're telling me that I can't live in my country and I'm not part of the society that I live in. And because of my, race or ethnicity, I've got to go live somewhere else." And that sounds pretty ridiculous. That actually sounds pretty offensive. And that is what happened when these guys first started to push their Zionist agenda. The Jews got really offended. And then, as we're taught in history class, World War II happened, the Jews were persecuted, large numbers of them were murdered, and the survivors had nowhere to go, so they went to Israel. That's what they teach you in history class, at least that's what they teach us in history class here in America. But the part they leave out is that the Zionists worked with the anti-Semites because they both had the same goals. And they actually both had the same beliefs. See, the anti-Semites are the people who were prejudiced against Jewish people. And they also believed that the Jews couldn't integrate into European society and that they should go somewhere else. So at some point, these rich European Jews who wanted to create the state of Israel for their own purposes decided to fund the anti-Semitic politicians because they both had the same goal. They realized that the more anti-Semitic Europe became, the more the Jews would want to leave. So, before World War II, most of the Jews rejected the Zionist message and decided to continue to live in their home countries. And a few of them left and went to Israel before World War II. But most of them stayed in their home countries, and because of that, they ended up dying in the Holocaust. Please don't run the bunter while I'm filming my video. But before they called Israel, Israel, they called it the Jewish state. They wanted to form a Jewish state. They wanted all the Jewish people to live in their own state. And once they got them there, what happened to them? Are these Jewish people all happily, freely living in their own state where they're so free that they're free to practice Judaism without the fear of anti-Semitism? No, they're in a prison. They're living in one big giant prison. I'm not talking about the Palestinians either. I'm talking about the Israelis. Israel isn't a good place for Jewish people. Israel isn't pro-Jewish. In Israel, every single person has to join the army. Between high school and college, every man, every woman, they all have to join the army. It's worse than having the draft. They don't just have the draft when they have a war. Everybody in their whole society is drafted. So if you're born in Israel, and you're, Jewish, not a Palestinian, you're, born to be drafted. And you could be forced to commit, horrible atrocities that you might not want to commit, but you have to commit them because you have to follow orders. And even after they leave the army, they're still, on call for the rest of their lives. If there's a war, they can be called up and they have to, drop their lives and go back to the army. So basically, they're born into slavery, and they're slaves for their entire life. And they're worse than just slaves. They're just disposable human beings. They could just be sent to fight and to die for somebody else's agenda. An agenda that they may not necessarily agree with. And I've seen people, here in America who were drafted in the war during Vietnam. And some of them were actually sent to war, and some of them were never sent to war, but just the fact that they were drafted into the army and they lived with the fear of being sent to war, they're traumatized for life with post-traumatic stress syndrome. So consider the mental implications of growing up in a society where every single person is drafted into the army. Basically, the Jewish people in Israel are trapped in a society that they can never escape from, where they're marginalized and oppressed. And the worst part about it is that they think they're free, and a lot of their families went there for religious freedom. And they end up marginalized and oppressed, living in a prison where they think they're free. And that was the goal of the Holocaust. That was the purpose of the Holocaust. That was why they did it. I'm not saying that's why the Nazis did it, but that is why the big they funded the Nazis. It was so the state of Israel could be created. And who are the big they? The big they would be the secret people who really control the world. Some people call them the Illuminati. Some people believe they're aliens or reptilians or all kinds of weird, interesting stuff. But whatever you believe that they are, you've got to look at all events in history and all current events from the perspective of what they are trying to achieve. And what they're trying to achieve is to have everybody totally under their control. And one of the best ways that they can do that is to get all these groups of people into all these little countries where they are living under totalitarian control. If they really want to hurt the people, they can put them into totalitarian countries like Israel, the Jewish state, which is a militant theocracy. A theocracy being a nation that's controlled by a religion. Because Israel isn't really a democracy, it's a theocracy. And it's militant because every single person has to join the army and because of all the violence they're committing against the Palestinians. So it's really sad, you know, all of these Jewish people who moved to Israel because they thought they were going to be free to be Jewish there without being harmed by anti-Semitism. They're now actually slaves, and all of their offspring are slaves. And not only that, Israel is actually a really anti-Semitic country. First of all, the people who rule Israel, they're basically the white Jewish people. They're like the least Semitic people of all the Jews. I'm not going to say that they're not Semitic at all, but they're like the least Semitic. And they have been racially prejudiced against the Semitic Jews. And they've done some really horrible prejudiced things to the Semitic Jews. For example, taking away their babies and giving them to the European Jews. And then look at what they've done to the black Jews, forcing the black Jews to have birth control injections against their will, without them even knowing what they were being injected to. They thought they were getting some kind of vaccine, and it was a birth control injection. Then they're like, why can't we get pregnant? Why aren't we having babies? Because the Israeli government was trying to control the black Jewish population. In a manner similar to the way the Nazis had a breeding program to breed their ideal race. And the Holocaust should not be called the Holocaust, because that is actually an ancient Jewish word for human sacrifice, which is actually really disturbing if you think about it. It kind of seems like it's an inappropriate word to use for the massacre of millions of people. Like, did they think of that as a human sacrifice? That was the sacrifice that they needed to make to create the state of Israel? I don't know. It doesn't really matter to me. It's just something I find disturbing, personally. So what does any of this have to do with ISIS? What does Israel or Zionism have to do with ISIS? What does the history of World War II or the Holocaust have to do with current events? Because ISIS is basically like Zionism for Muslims. Basically, if you replace the word Jewish with Muslim, you have the exact same ideology. The ideology that a people, last time Jews, this time Muslims, can't live in Western society, and they've got to go live in their own state. Last time a Jewish state, this time the Islamic State, ISIS. So basically, they're using the same exact brainwashing program that they used in the Jews on the Muslims. And they want them to wind up in the same exact situation, in a militant theocracy that they have to fight and die for. What a convenient way to get rid of them. And just like Israel is actually an anti-Semitic country masquerading as a pro-Jewish nation, ISIS is actually an anti-Muslim organization masquerading as a pro-Muslim organization. Look, most of the people that they kill are Muslims, and they're basically on a mission to tarnish Muslims' reputation worldwide. They're doing everything they can to convince the whole world that Muslims are bad. So, the whole world will try to get rid of their Muslims, and they'll have nowhere to go because, just like what's happening with the Syrian refugees, nobody wants them because they're scared of them because they're Muslims and they might be terrorists. So if every single European country decided to make their Muslims leave, or if the Muslims had to leave because something like the Holocaust was going on, they were going to die if they didn't leave, they'd have nowhere to go. And then just like when Jews are being persecuted in France, and the president of Israel is like, oh, come to Israel, you'll be safe here, ISIS will be like, oh, come to us. And whether they want to go there or not, a lot of them are going to be forced to go there because there won't be anywhere else they can go without being killed in something awful like the Holocaust or being locked up in some place like Guantanamo. And at the same time, there's politicians like Donald Trump here in America and like the numerous politicians that have been elected all across Europe in numerous different countries that are pushing this really Islamophobic agenda. But the ideology that they're preaching is exactly the same as the ideology that ISIS is preaching. They're saying that Muslims can't live in Western society because they can't integrate. They're trying to tell you that you don't belong in their society unless you change yourself to be like them. While at the same time, ISIS is saying you don't belong in that society because you're not like them. And if you listen to Donald Trump and what politicians like him are saying, they're basically saying the same thing about Muslims that the anti-Semitic politicians were saying about Jews before World War II. They were literally saying the exact same things. They may have been saying it in another language, they may have been saying the word Jewish instead of Muslim, but they were making the same exact accusations related to like not integrating into society or secretly trying to take control. Well, looking back at history and how the Zionists worked with the anti-Semitic politicians, it makes me wonder if ISIS and the Islamophobic politicians are working together because they have the same goal, to get rid of the Muslims, to push them out of the Western countries and have them wind up just like the Jews in Israel, marginalized and oppressed in a militant theocracy where they have to fight and they have to die just as a convenient way to get rid of them. So that's what ISIS is. It's just a convenient way to get rid of you. It's a convenient way to trap you and your offspring in a prison where you will be trapped for the rest of your life and your offspring will be trapped for the rest of their lives. And looking at the state of Israel and how long it's been there, you don't know how many generations of your offspring could be trapped. In the same way that the Jews are trapped in the Jewish state, your offspring will be trapped in the Islamic State if you join ISIS. And not only that, joining ISIS is completely anti-purposeful. And what I mean by that is, if you're a Muslim and you're considering joining ISIS, it's probably because you believe that you would be doing a good thing for Muslims. However, every single time that somebody joins ISIS, it's in the news, and the news says, oh, another one of these Muslims joined ISIS, that proves that they all secretly support ISIS. And then they will use that to promote their Islamophobic agenda, which will then push more Muslims out of their societies. It's like a vicious cycle. So you're just fueling the fire of that vicious cycle. Every time that a Muslim commits a terrorist attack and says they did it for ISIS, Donald Trump is going to come out and say, they proved me right. They proved me right. They proved that they're all bad. They're literally already laying out the groundwork for the next Holocaust. And like I said, I don't believe in using the word Holocaust, but that's what they're doing. They're laying the groundwork for the next Holocaust. And not only are they laying the groundwork for the next Holocaust, but in a lot of places, Muslims are already experiencing a level of fear and discrimination that's equal to what Jews experienced right before the Holocaust. And it might be hard for a lot of Muslims, especially Muslims who grew up in Muslim countries, to make the connection between current events and the history of World War II and the Holocaust, because a lot of Muslims who grew up in Muslim countries didn't really learn about the Holocaust in school the way that we did here in America. But even a lot of people who learned about the Holocaust in school in America, they're still having a hard time making the connection between history and current events. We're seeing the similarities between Donald Trump and Hitler. Like today, a friend of mine was over and he was saying that he wasn't sure if he was going to vote at all because Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are both so bad. And I said, I think Hillary Clinton is terrible. I think she's absolutely terrible. But Donald Trump is just so much worse because he's a Nazi. And my friend looked at me and he said, Donald Trump is a Nazi? Well, how could he not see that Donald Trump is a Nazi? How can you not see that Donald Trump is just like Hitler? How can you not see that ISIS is the same thing as Israel, or that their push for Muslims to go back to their homeland is the same as the push for Jews to go back to the homeland? That Islamophobia is the same as anti-Semitism, and that they, meaning the Illuminati, are using the same tactics of false flag attacks. And if you don't believe me, you can look this up. There's a hit list, a list of Muslim Americans that ISIS has a real problem with. But Donald Trump also has a real problem with those same people. ISIS says they've abandoned Islam because they're working with the Americans. Donald Trump says they're working for ISIS and they're here to promote Sharia law. Why do both Donald Trump and ISIS both have a problem with this list of people? Because they're secretly both working for the same people, and those people have a problem with that list of people. Because that list of people are working against their agenda of dividing, because they're working to help Muslims and Westerners get along. So they sent their henchmen, their ISIS henchmen, and their Republican henchmen, including Donald Trump and his team, after those people. And ISIS basically doesn't really exist. At least it doesn't exist in the sense of this group of Muslims that are trying to create the ideal Muslim community. That's just a lie. Those people are like working for like the CIA and Mossad or the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, codename ISIS. And what's worse is that these Illuminati people have a secret pagan agenda. So they're getting all these Muslims to swear allegiance to ISIS, who's really a pagan goddess. So as you can see from what I've explained, ISIS is not a Muslim organization, and they're not pro-Muslim in any way at all. And you can tell that they hate Muslims. They like how badly they treat their people. Like the Muslims that are living in the Islamic State, if they like break any little law, they could be beaten, tortured, or even killed. And if they were really a pro-Muslim organization, they wouldn't treat their own people badly. They wouldn't kill other types of Muslims for being the wrong type of Muslim. In one of my other YouTube videos where I ranted about why I don't like Donald Trump, one of the things I said is that Donald Trump and ISIS are kind of like two heads on a two-headed monster, but really they're two heads on a multi-headed monster. And what is that multi-headed monster? Because it's not a two-headed monster. It's a multi-headed monster. Because it doesn't only have two heads. It's got like tons of heads. The leaders of a lot of other European countries would be some of the monster's ugly heads. But what is the actual monster itself that's buried in there, showing all of its ugly heads? You don't ever actually see the real monster, because the real monster is the so-called Illuminati, the people who secretly, or not so secretly, control the world. And those people are the real enemy. Those people do not have a good agenda. Not for Muslims, not for Jews, not for Christians, not for anybody. Those people have a really evil agenda involving mass murder and global domination. And you don't want to be a part of their agenda. And ISIS is just one of the manifestations of their agenda that you don't want anything to do with at all whatsoever. Now, I really shouldn't need to say this, but if anyone who's watching this video says, wait a minute, the situation with Muslims is different than the situation with Jews before World War II, because Muslims really are doing something wrong. They're like committing all these awful terrorist attacks and stuff, and Jews were just like innocent. What you've got to remember is that the Nazis were not portraying the Jews to be innocent. The Nazis were doing a really good job at convincing their people that the Jews really were doing something wrong, to the point of orchestrating false flag attacks. Does that sound familiar? So if, for example, you believe that the Twin Towers were destroyed by Muslim hijackers, you should go on YouTube and watch some documentaries about 9/11. There's a really good one that's called something like 9/11 Conspiracy Solved, Names, Places, and Dates, that explains a lot more about who's really responsible for 9/11. It's different from a lot of the other documentaries made by 9/11 truthers that focus on how the buildings fell and how it's scientifically not possible for the planes to have destroyed the buildings. I mean, you should watch those documentaries too if you haven't, but definitely watch the Conspiracy Solved, Names, Places, and Faces, or whatever it's called, because it's really more important to know who actually committed the crime than how they did it, in my opinion. And you know that they're going to try to make the Holocaust happen again. One of the ways you know is if you listen to Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd actually predicted the next Holocaust in several of their songs. For example, on the final cut there's a song that goes, "And I suffer premonitions, confirmed suspicions of the Holocaust to come." And there's several other references on that album about their plans for the next Holocaust and stuff. So if you haven't already listened to Pink Floyd, you should definitely listen to Pink Floyd, especially The Wall and The Final Cut, because they predict the future. And they've got a lot of good advice in their songs that you really should listen to. I made this video even though I know that a lot of people are going to be mad at me, because this stuff just needs to be said. Because if it's not said, and if things keep going the way they are, we're definitely going to have World War III and a second Holocaust. And who knows how many people are going to die this time. And remember, Hitler did not just go after the Jews. Hitler went after everybody. So even if you think that you're safe because you're one of the types of people that Donald Trump or whatever politician is running your country is okay with, you're not safe. They can turn on you just like they turn on anyone else, because you mean nothing to them. Absolutely nothing. They don't care if you live or die. They just want their end result. And that is all. And if you want to know what end result they want, look at the George Guidestones. They want to destroy all world religions. They want to destroy all world languages. They want to reduce the population by killing off almost all of us. And then they want to control who can breed. And their entire agenda is a bad agenda. We don't want everybody in the world to speak the same language. We don't want everybody in the world to be forced to be the same religion of their choice. That's a horrible future that nobody that I know actually wants. You don't want somebody else telling you whether or not you can breed, because you know what, if they don't like your opinions, they can just decide that you can't have a child, and then one generation later, their problem is gone. And we don't need to reduce the Earth's population. The Earth isn't overpopulated. Only certain areas of it are overpopulated. And they're doing everything they can to force people out of rural areas into cities so they can make it seem more overpopulated. But it's really not. It's a terrible, horrible, disgusting, awful agenda. And you don't want to have any part in helping them make that agenda a reality. And on that note, I'm ending my video.